Hello, and welcome to Productivity in Prose, a podcast about making the most of your writing time and honing your craft. Whether you're a seasoned author or a new writer, this podcast offers helpful tips to maximize your writing time, increase your writing productivity, and tackle the sometimes tough aspects of the writer life. I'm your host, Emily, author of Suspended in the Stars, among other things, and today's topic is, how do you know if you're ready to publish? This is a very personal topic, and I'm not going to say that I am the person to answer it for you. However, I want to walk us through 5 questions that you can ask yourself when it comes to publishing to gauge if you're ready or not. I also want to dive deeper into the options a new or previously published author has for independently publishing or traditionally publishing. Let's start with some questions for a pre-published author. 1. Is your book written? Okay, this may sound like a dumb thing to ask, but honestly, is it written? I put this question first not to shame anyone who doesn't have their book done yet, but to let a fire under those of you who want to be published. I get that it takes time. Technically, it took me 10 years to publish a book of my heart, and the other things I did publish, while I loved those projects too, didn't compare to putting Suspended in the Stars out. But back to the question. I honestly believe that the one thing that separates published authors from writers is finishing a book. And I don't want that to sound like gatekeeping or elitism or anything like that. It's just the simple fact that if you want to be a published author, you have to finish your books. For those of you who want to be on the path to publishing, my advice is simple, but not necessarily easy. Finish your book. Finish your book. Finish it. If you're arguing with me by way of the speakers, hear me out, friends. Yes, it takes hard work. I know you may not have all of your plot points down. I realize your draft needs a lot of work, especially chapter 1. But if you are always rewriting the first half or even the first 3/4 of your book, you're never going to finish it. But I believe in you. Push through to the end. I promise, while it won't exactly get easier when you finish, you'll know that you can write a book, and that is a huge step in the right direction. So if you can say your book is written and you've taken time to self-edit, it's time to move on to the next step. Number 2, have you had someone or several people read over it? Who were they and what did they think? This is the next step, but it can also be a terrifying step for some. I realize there are authors out there who only ever wrote their book for themselves and submitted it to an agent or editor and got a contract. Bravo! But that is usually not the case for most writers. The next logical step after you've finished your rough draft and you've edited through it yourself to the best of your ability is to have someone else read it. Who you choose to read it does matter. I know there are some out there whose spouse is their first reader, and that is awesome and can totally work. But I think having someone who will be objective and who has experience as a critique partner or alpha or beta reader is crucial. If you're truly seeking publication, this step is not the one where you'll want all of your friends to tell you how amazing you are. This is the step where you want someone, or a few someones, to tell you the strengths and the weaknesses of your rough draft. When I ask, who's reading your work? I mean, what qualifies that person or persons to read your manuscript and give you their opinion? And when I ask, what do they think? I want more than just, they loved it or they said it needed work. At this stage in your writing, it is vital to have at least one person who you trust who will read your work with honesty and an eye toward making it better. Not that they suggest changes just to change things, but that what they point out is actually going to help your book be better. If you don't have this person yet, I'd suggest going to a writers' conference or joining an organization. I'm part of ACFW, American Christian Fiction Writers, and they have critique groups where you can try out different critique partners to find one that fits. Don't look for someone who will tell you what you want to hear, but someone whose advice makes sense for your story and who you mesh well with. There are also options for paid critiques at some conferences and even submitting to some contests where you can get your unpublished manuscript judged by others. These options can provide insight, but it's not always the best format to get critique. A little note here. One thing I want to point out is the tendency that contest focus can give to some newer writers. Usually these contests are focused on the first 5 pages or the first chapter of a work. It's great to get that insight and immediately want to implement those changes, but be wary of taking every piece of advice and be especially wary of polishing just the beginning of your book so much that you forget about the rest. I know that some writers will focus exclusively on those first 3 sample chapters in their proposal. The problem is, when they get the request for a full manuscript from an agent or an editor, they get a rejection because their work grabbed attention at the front end but couldn't keep it throughout, either due to a lack of writing skills, poor plotting, or some other misfunction. This is not to scare any of you away from contests or anything like that, but if you can find a partner in crime who reads what you write, and you read what they write, and your mutual goal is to make both of your stories better, you're going to be on a great track. Let's say you've finished your book, you've had critique partners, and maybe even a few beta readers go over that book, and you've got a solid thumbs up from everyone. The next question to ask is it relevant to today's publishing industry? This is a sticky subject. While there is a lot of talk in support of writing to market, there is also a lot of talk against it. Basically, writing to market means that you're taking into account current trends and writing to those trends. For example, right now, thanks to Fourth Wing, dragons are hot. A lot of publishers are jumping on that train because of that. But it's just that, it's a fad. There's nothing wrong with this at all, and I think dragons will always be interesting and still popular. But knowing that it will fade out is what's important to remember. Arguments against writing to market state that no matter what trends are popular, your story should be well written and from your heart. That's what matters. I agree with that, but I also see the value of popular market-heavy books. Here's where an indie author can get a leg up over a traditional house because an indie author has the ability to drop one thing and pick up another as quickly as they can. If I have a dragon book, my Dragons in Space story, for example, then it makes sense to push that now due to the fad. If I want to submit a proposal to a publisher for that same book, I may not be able to get it in time, or they might be oversaturated already. The point is, it's a little more nuanced because while I do think it's important to consider marketing and the current industry, I don't think it's the only thing to consider, and I also don't think it's something that should stop you from publishing or submitting, though it might be something that does. Also remember this, it works both ways. Remember that virus that must not be named? Well, any books about pathogens or viruses like that would have been ill-timed for a submission in 2020. You have to read the market and know what's hot and what's not before you're ready to publish. If you've done that, then the next thing to consider is number 4. Have you done your research? This is huge and separate from writing to the market. You don't, or maybe I should say you shouldn't, just go out, pick a random agent, and send them your manuscript. That's a big no-no, and that is due to the fact that certain agents accept certain things and dislike a lot when people send them proposals for things they don't represent. I can't tell you how many stories I've heard, not only from my agent or our agency's head, but also from other agents at conferences about the ridiculous queries or proposals they've received and how they laughed all the way to the delete button. We're talking people who are saying they're writing the next Bible or something like that. It's pretty crazy. Submitting to agents the right way is probably a topic for an entirely different podcast episode. If you want to hear about best ways to engage an agent and what to do and not to do, let me know. Anyway, do your research. Know what publishers you'd like to go with, and not just because they're big and cool, but because they've published books like your book. Know what agents you're interested in representing you, and know if you write what they represent. Know how to write a good query letter, how to establish a connection with an agent or an editor, and how to write your proposal in such a way that it hits all the points that an editor wants to see. Know all of these things before you press submit. Now, I realize there are several steps here, and things are going to look very different if you're indie publishing versus traditional publishing, so let's break it down. Everything I just said is true for anyone seeking traditional publishing, whether they want an agent or are just submitting to an editor, large or small press. However, if you're going indie, the research here is so different. We're talking how and where you want your books to be published, who will you get to edit, who will design your cover, who will format your book, how will you market it, and so many other details. At this point in the process, if you are considering going indie, this will be the spot that hangs you up or makes you pause before moving forward. It can take a month or a year, but you need to put in the hard work to know what you're going to do before you start down this path to publishing. Whether you're going traditional or indie, the final question of this process is, number 5, do you have a plan? If you've been around for my first few episodes, you know this about me now, but I love a good plan. But unlike plotting or planning out a writing year, I honestly think everyone needs to have a plan for their publishing route. It can be as loose or as detailed as you want, but it must be in existence, and here's why. Going the traditional route to publishing isn't as easy as just saying that's what you want to do. It takes perseverance to do that research. It takes countless hours of refining your work to send. It takes time and energy pushing yourself out of your shell to meet agents and editors if you can. And it takes stamina to weather the rejections, of which there may be a few or there may be many. If you've chosen to go indie, a plan is even more of a must, or else you'll get lost in the midst of everything you have to do. You have to have all of those things in order, but you have to also let people know about your book, get it up to the right websites to publish, and have the next book and the next in the pipeline ready to go. Because if there's one thing you'll always hear me say, it's this: write the next book. What I'm saying is this: know what you're going to do, even if it's just 4 steps into the future. For the traditional route, those steps might look like: Step 1, compile a list of agents or editors to submit to. Step 2, polish or write my query letter to industry standards. Step 3, create a schedule of follow-up times. Step 4, send out queries. For the independent route, those steps might look like: Step 1, pick an editor and cover designer and make a budget. Step 2, pick a release date and work backwards from that date for the timeline for editing and design. Step 3, research how to upload your book into Amazon and other retailers. Step 4, connect with a group of readers willing to read and review an arc of your book. Now, clearly, there are other steps involved for both of those options, but I suggest not moving forward until you have at least a basic plan. Well, how did you rate? Did you pass each one? You've got a book written, it's been read by critique partners who know your genre and have helped hone your book into something that shines. It's relevant for today's industry, you've done your research, and you've got a plan. Then, I think you're ready to publish. But how do you know which way to go, traditional or indie? Before I fully move into this topic, a word to currently traditional authors who are considering independently publishing. Is it scary? A little. But can it be hugely helpful for your career? Yes. I've had the chance to work with several traditionally published authors who wanted to take a step into indie publishing, either when a contract ended or they got their rights back to older books. I think republishing a previously published book is a great first step into indie publishing, and it's definitely something to consider. Though, I will mention here there are some pitfalls to avoid when it comes to having all the right paperwork ready to go to prove ownership of your book, but that's another topic for another day. Another argument for trying out indie publishing is the fact that it is increasingly difficult to make a living as a solely traditional author, unless you're hugely successful. I remember having a conversation with an agent many years ago who said they didn't think it was possible for an author to make a living unless they were a hybrid, which basically means being both traditionally and independently published. And I agree. If you've got current contracts going, it can be hard to fit something in, or potentially illegal, so make sure you know that first. But there are opportunities for novellas and short novels, as some contracts stipulate you have access to write and sell fiction under a certain number of words. You can also have your agent negotiate with newer contracts to allow for indie publishing. It's a big step, and it can be scary going from having a publisher do everything to having to do it all on your own. But my advice is to find someone, perhaps a virtual assistant or an author's assistant, who's helped authors and works with them regularly. While it's not technically part of my job as a designer and a formatter, I have helped my friends and seen them soar with each new independent release. Okay, here are some questions to ask that can help you decide which direction is right for you, traditional or indie. Number 1, what's your end goal? Let's start at the end. Where do you want to be with your writing in a year? 2 years? 5? 10? I agree that we should dream big here, as I like to say, but follow that up with some realistic thoughts as well. First of all, will you only be happy if you see your physical books in a store like Target? then you may want to consider traditional publishing. I'm not saying you can't get your books into Target as an indie, but it's a lot less likely. Do you just want to write and publish as many books as possible and can sustain a multiple book a year writing schedule? Indie might be a great option for you. Or do you like the idea of being both traditional and independently published? Then you'll need to consider your approach to that. Number 2, how patient are you? Publishing takes time. No matter what route you take, you're going to have some patience. But I do think indie publishing takes a little less patience, but let's break it down. Traditional publishing, unless you have a massive platform, and even then it's not guaranteed, takes time to break into. Time up front to put in your dues of getting to know agents and editors, to know the market, and to carefully craft your queries and proposals. Yes, this can go quickly and has for some, but I'm talking about the average person's experience from those I know and of my own life. Once you find an agent, and again, I'm talking about mainstream big house traditional publishing where you 99 out of 100 times need an agent, then you have to find an editor who's interested in your book. When you do, there's more time involved while they take it to the pub board or publishing board. That board decides what books the house will actually publish. Sometimes it's not enough to have an editor or even 2 on your side, and that's where your book finds its end, at least for the time being. But let's say you have made it past pub board, and then, guess what? More time. You've got to go through multiple rounds of edits, the design process, marketing plans, and everything that entails until the book is out. Then you start that process over again, at least in some respects, for your next book and your next book. You will not usually have a book out every 6 months. It often takes a year or longer due to publishing schedules. On the other side, independently publishing a book also takes time, but you're more in control of your timeline. You still have to wait on editors, wait on a designer and a formatter, and wait for the publishing date you set. But generally, this process can go a bit quicker if you wish it to. You can also publish faster than traditional as long as you can sustain that as a writer. If you're wondering about your capacity, make sure you listen to episode 5. But it's not as easy as it sounds to go indie. Remember, you have to market your own book or hire someone to, since you don't have the backing of a traditional house. And this is hugely important to remember, you aren't guaranteed instant success just because you published your book. The statistics say that most indie authors don't start seeing a profit, or at least a significant one, until they've published 6 to 8 books. I'm not saying that traditional publishing pays that much more, unless you're V.E. Schwab or Leigh Bardugo, but you will likely see more profit up front with a traditional house than you will as an indie author. So how much patience do you have to see your book out in the world? How much can you afford to wait until you're paid for your work? Number 3, how business-minded and hands-on are you? This is, I think, where most people go to when they explain why they don't want to be independently published. It's a lot to learn how to publish your own book, and that curve is often what makes most people afraid of going indie. While there are still things to learn as a traditionally published author, especially things like keeping deadlines and working with your publisher to market your books, it's not as steep as putting out your own book. If the thought of learning everything you need to know is insurmountable in your mind, that might be an indication you might be better off traditionally published. But if the thought of making your own choices, cheering on your own books, and publishing as frequently as you want sends your heart singing, maybe indie is the perfect place for you. And lastly, number 4, what do you want? Let me tell you a little story here. I wrote my first official project when I was a senior in high school. That's a whole story on its own. The part that matters here is that I just knew I wanted to be published by Bethany House Publishers. They were then, and are still today, a premier publisher of Christian fiction, which was pretty much all I read back in high school. And I thought, I will have finally arrived when I'm published by them. And then a funny thing happened. I learned more about the publishing industry. So much more. Now, that's not to say that Bethany House or any other large publisher isn't still an intriguing option, and makes me tingle to think of being published by them. But I'm no longer baby Emily, and I've come to see that there are so many roads to publishing. And in this day and age, indie publishing is nothing to look down on. In fact, it's grown in popularity so much and is so respected that many authors who took their books indie when they couldn't get the attention of a large press have now been signed to traditional houses. Basically, what I realized was that my dream had shifted from I'll only be successful if I'm traditionally published to I want to write and publish books. That means that I keep my options open for both traditional and indie routes. I might submit my book out, like I did with Suspended in the Stars, but I will not feel defeated if it's not picked up. I'll just publish it myself. That's my story, but you may be in a different part of your story. You might have your sights set on a dream publisher, and I tell you, go for it. You don't have to change your goals, but you may have to wait a little longer for them to be realized, or wait longer until they shift if they don't come to fruition like you'd hoped. There's nothing wrong with that. What matters is to know what your ultimate goals are for your books and work towards that. A word on small presses here. I've mentioned small press before on the podcast and will testify to the fact that there are several who do an outstanding job, like Enclave Publishing, who I get to design covers for sometimes. They started out as a small press, and I would say they have rocketed into midsize in such an amazing way. You just never know where a press may go. If you desperately don't want to be indie published due to the amount of learning it will take, trust me, I get it. And if you've tried and failed to gain the attention of a large publisher, then you might consider going with a small press, but hear this, do your research. Not all small presses are the same, and you need to ask smart questions, especially for signing without an agent. I may need to do an episode on this because I've had questions from people about what to look for, good and bad, with contracts with small press and things like that. While I am not an agent, I have a few things I could share. If that's something you want to hear, let me know. Anyway, do your research and never, I mean never, go with a company that forces you to pay to publish. There are some exceptions to this if they are offering to self-publish your book for you, but in that case, they would not be a publisher. They would be a hybrid or self-publishing company. A publisher will negotiate the rights to your book and offer compensation to you, and then they're the ones responsible for taking care of editing, cover design, and marketing to some degree. I think the reason I want to hit on small press here is that it's easy to just put up a digital storefront and say, I will publish your book. But that doesn't mean anything if they don't A, have a good track record of sales with their other books, or B, offer market standard compensation, or C, work with quality designers to make covers that are competitive in your market, and D, actually market and help you market your book. I have heard so many awful horror stories of people who signed with a small press that they thought was good, only to end up in legal battles or with covers that are bad or editing that harmed the book. All of it not good. So please do your research. Well, while I didn't tell you which way to go, I hope that today's episode has given you some food for thought with regards to publishing, whether independently or traditionally. It can and likely will be a difficult path for any to walk, no matter which fork in the road is taken. But rest in the knowledge that options will crop up and you can shift your focus at any time. And let me add this as a word to newer writers. I know the temptation will be to just find a way to publish your book as quickly as possible. Don't give in to that. Back in the previous point number 2, when I talked about having someone or a few people read your work, I think that is the easiest place where things start to break down. Writers either step past valuable insight into their work or they don't ask the right people for input. It's going to be tempting to have that friend who loves everything you do give you feedback, but that's not always the most valuable for your book. Missing this step can lead to submitting underdeveloped books to agents or editors and being rejected, or it can lead to independently publishing a book that needed more time and revision, and that leads to negative reviews and failing sales. Make sure you've got eyes on your work at every single stage to help you learn, hone, and shape your craft. In the next episode, I'll be talking about getting past fear in writing and, imposter syndrome. This is a big one for many, including myself, and I hope to alleviate some fears and encourage as well. Thanks so much for listening, and don't forget to dream big and write boldly. If you enjoyed this episode and you'd like to help support the podcast, please subscribe and leave a rating and review. If you're looking for more writing inspiration, community, craft tips, and behind-the-scenes content, consider joining the EAH Coalition on Patreon with various levels of free and paid support. You can also connect with me on Instagram at CreateExploreRead and find out more about me, my books, and my design business on my website, eahcreative.com. Productivity in Prose is an EAH Creative production.